In this real-side experience, I would find myself in a situation where it appeared I had been waiting for an opportunity, biding my time, and when the opportunity that I sought availed itself, so would I make my move. For into a police station I would go, with a sense of a purpose, a knowingness, that the time was at hand. This was the moment I had seemingly been waiting for. And there I would find myself in the waiting area, where citizens and civilians would first enter the station, make their presence known with the officer stationed at the desk, and explain their reason for being there, their complaint, their grievances, all the various reasons a citizen might have for entering a police station. No other individual would be present, save for the officer stationed at the desk, and the cursory glance he would give me, before returning his focus to whatever it was he was preoccupying himself with, waiting for me to approach the window that separated him from the waiting area, and then would he give me his attention. However, laid neatly on one of the seats provided would be a police uniform. A uniform that for whatever reason had been left here in what was the waiting area for citizens, as opposed to where you might expect it to be left, that being in a part of the station where the officers operated and went about their business. And my purpose became apparent then, as I would gather up this uniform in my arms, very slowly and in such a way that didn't draw the attention of the police officer stationed behind the desk, rather a case of nonchalance as to my movements, not looking in any way suspicious, as perhaps quick furtive movements may have come across as being, and with a slow deliberation that didn't seize the officer's focus from what he was doing, because I knew this wasn't my uniform, and were I to be caught in the act of what was a theft of it, naturally I would be in a spot of bother, and with the lack of attentiveness on the part of the desk officer, so would I be able to take possession of the uniform, and just as slowly and casually exit the waiting area and the police station without being caught in the act of my uniform pilfering. The scene would switch. Several months had elapsed, as by my reckoning, and it seemed I now was operating in the capacity of a policeman, but in a different city. The uniform had been the last item I seemingly had required. It had belonged to another officer, that was currently in service in the city I had stolen it from. For now, not only was I a cop also, but I was masquerading as that very cop whose uniform I had stolen. However, I had no actual training. I wasn't registered as an official cop, and therefore not recognized as such. But regardless, it was as though I had stolen not only the uniform of an actual cop, but his identity also. A cop who was in fact a sergeant, which would be the first ranked position a cop can aspire to, beyond the first tier of the police force. At least in the UK, this would be so, at any rate. Naturally then, it ought have been apparent to anyone who scrutinized my activities as to my inadequacy with a position that suggested and demanded great experience. And yet, it seems I was able to pull it off, almost to learn on the fly, and despite my lack of training, and that I was in actuality operating under a false and stolen identity, I did seem especially skilled with citizen relationships, a veritable favourite among the peoples of the city, the kind of a cop that you'd want to go to with your issues. There came a point, however, where I knew my ruse would be up, that I would be exposed, a situation or other where, despite my success at pulling off what was a faked position up until now, that this situation, whatever it was, would reveal the fakery, and the game would be over. The experience ended there, and an experience, in fact, that was several months ago, but one that had been forgotten until it would be replayed again more recently, but with additional detail that revealed what it had been about. For during the replay it would seem familiar, and the first consideration would be that perhaps it was a past life or other dimensional flashback, as naturally any lifetime we have been through, although that which we are unconscious of from the perspective of our current personal self, is nevertheless stored in the causal akashic records of the created self. Also everything ever experienced in not just the lifetimes our personal self has been through, but the lifetimes of all personal selves, is available for perusal in the universal files of the real universes. The body vehicles do retain the experiences and lifetimes, like files on a computer, but more a secondary source of information, and in fact that which has capacity, and that which also can be tampered with and altered, and not necessarily for beneficial purposes either. All consciousness in this creational simulator is rather interfused with agreements to the reptilian controllers, as these ill-intended characters determined how creation works, how it is the overall consciousness, and how it is programmed with the idea agreements it contains that affects the overall simulation situation. And so, to control a simulator, the dark forces would have to have agreement from the vast majority within it, that not only could they then feature in the experience of the vast majority, but that their specific ideas of control were agreed with also, with the result then of the overall consciousness in agreement with the ideas of restriction and control created by the dark force reptilians, which would then effect overall a simulation based on this overall agreement, and the reptilians would then have their simulation of domination. This agreement of control then permits those that control has been surrendered to manipulate the consciousness in any way they decide. It's like everybody who remains immersed with their controlled consciousness is in open agreement for manipulation of their consciousness, as though we had openly given our passwords of our computers that contain all our reference information to another, that they can access it and alter or change it, delete files or rearrange the details however they wish. Hence why the Akashic records, the personal self files of lifetimes lived, are unreliable, with these agreements through the consciousness that allow for manipulation of them. The universal files, on the other hand, are beyond tampering, as they are beyond creation and the personal selves. They are in a position then where free will doesn't apply, and so there would be no consideration, want, or inclination to do anything other than just be that which is a true reality, isness everything. And should there be the want to create an idea, to decide something, to use free will, this is something in addition then to what is an absolute reality. And what could you add to something that's absolute? You couldn't in fact do so. You would instead encapsulate something that isn't this everything absolute reality, and to experience an encapsulated thing that isn't everything can only be done in a reality that isn't this isness true reality, which would be then in creation. So in the real universes of the is, there can be no agendas or ideas, as these are encapsulated realities then that are aside from a reality that is everything. only this being everything state is that which is with the true reality, and to recognize and be that. And so it remains, and always is, a pure reality, beyond anything the mind can consider, want, and formulate, including the inclination to tamper with anything. Hence why nothing of this nature can take place. For the moment you decide to do or be anything that isn't just this real awareness, beingness state of everything, then this can only be in a position that is aside from it, the creational, simulated worlds. And as the real universes of the is everything, that would include everything that has ever been in all the creational simulators, including all the lifetimes lived in them through all the personal selves. The idea reference applied to this database, where accessing of all lifetimes can be so, would be then the universal files. And very often, when real side experiences seem familiar, it is that the real awareness recognizes that which our personal self has been through before. The personal self only has access to that which it has stored as experiences in its current lifetime, as the mental aspect is always recreated each lifetime around, as though the computer was reset and everything on it was erased. But although the files are erased each time around, it's as though what was available on the surface had been shifted to backup files, the Akashic records, and these are accessible through our real awareness. A real awareness that animates the personal self and its created consciousness. And as the real awareness is this isness everything reality, everything is available in the nowness of its reality, including everything of the consciousness and all the lifetimes that have been forged from its construction. Only from the perspective of the personal self simulation is there the concept of time, which is a cause and effect, which is a decided means of converting ideas into effect experiences as a process of sequences of events, of motion, and point to point, for a comparison to recognize what is this true reality of everything isness. And so, if we don't as yet recognize this isness, that we can't access then the universal files, the real awareness can at least access the secondary source, the causal Akashic files. And so this then explains why some experiences seem familiar, even though the personal self knows we haven't experienced them this lifetime on the physical or the real side. As the personal self receives these impressions of the recognition of them via the real awareness. However, the familiarity of this real side experience was in fact due to having had the same experience several months prior, as I said. As we do tend to be shown far more than the personal self can retain and bring back to the physical, so it is very often that experiences are lost, forgotten, but always there is the option of revisiting them again, as everything is available in every new moment of the isness of our real awareness. The entirety of creation and all the ideas it comprises of, and not just the ideas, the consciousness, and the experiences of our own personal self, but that of all consciousness and experiences in the simulator. For our real awareness is in fact one overall awareness that is everything and animates all personal selves, and only from the perspective of the personal self would it consider itself separate from everything else, a separateness that is essential to recognize the everything that everything is through comparison. And so we will always be shown what we need for our process of awareness, and can revisit anything we need to be re-shown, or with additional detail where necessary, where it makes sense to do so. For now, it seemed the rerun of the experience would be more or less a replay of the same experience, but reaching a point where whatever it was that happened, that exposed me as to the false cop identity, had taken place. I would never be shown exactly what that was, but only the repercussions. For now I was on the run. The cops were on my trail, seeking to apprehend and arrest me for my crime. Although, in the first experience, months ago, I had the view as though I was the actual individual, the identity stealer. In this rerun, it was more that I was in an observing capacity, a third-person perspective, a real awareness view of this individual carrying out his decided course of action. We might surmise that it was then just a shift in perspective from my personal self-view of being the simulation of my choices and intent to that of the real awareness overview of the simulation of the choices of the personal self. But my impressions were that it was more that I was having the view of the activities of another individual, and that the first experience of it was a full immersion into the consciousness of the individual. For as we are this one real awareness that is through all the consciousness and personal selves, we are in fact at liberty to have any view that is deemed beneficial for our awareness process from the perspective of any personal self in creation. But if we were to do so while retaining real awareness connection, we would know this was such a view from the perspective of another personal self, just like watching a movie on the television, and we would be rather indifferent to it. It would seem so very detached from us, and despite what's taking place in it, it would fail to impact us as it would a personal self that was engaged through its emotions in reaction to what was being watched, such as it is with a personal self which is fully immersed in its simulation, totally involved and emotionally invested. As such, it seems so very real to an individual just operating from the personal self perspective. And this is why then, on occasion, we are not only having an experience that stems from the choices and decisions of another, as we see it from the perspective of their personal self, but the real awareness disconnects from our personal selves, that we are fully immersed in the personal self of the individual whose experience we are viewing, so that we have total immersion. And in such cases, we experience everything their personal self was, their emotions, considerations, a far more intense experience, rather than one we would be objectively indifferent to, as we observed it while standing in our real awareness, and while immersed in the consciousness of another in such a real awareness disconnected way, we actually are then that consciousness until we remove ourselves from it or wake up on the physical. Without the real awareness connection, we can see how it would be very easy for the personal awareness to be moved from a consciousness to a consciousness, and have then no realization that this had taken place. It would simply take on the consciousness as though it were its own. This is what happens in the super soldier programs. Individuals having their personal awareness moved from one consciousness vehicle to another, then returned with no memory of what they had been doing, their military space operations. From the consciousness vehicle they were just in. Not only then should full immersion into the personal simulation, absent of real awareness, standing in difference, more likely have us remember such experiences better, as they then are more intense with the additional emotion, etc. But we also experience greater the personal self perspective of the individual, their consciousness and its construction, in regards to how it reacts, deals with, considers that which it goes through experience-wise, etc. And all these personal self-ideas, these creations, through the vehicles of it, from all the different body forms, consciousnesses, and lifetimes we have lived, all provide us with great diversity of references for comparisons to recognize the ears by. But with lifetimes in the cause and effect simulation being somewhat a drawn-out process for our reference comparisons, one lifetime at a time from the personal self perspective, that which we need for our awareness process, so can this be sped up on the real side, as it is ensured we have the viewpoints that we require through the additional source of these total personal self-immersion experiences into the consciousness of another, that there is something there that we needed to see. As an example, recently I had the total immersion into a reptilian consciousness to experience the emotions that the individual was creating in response to his situation, that of fear, to impress upon me how the reptilians are as much racked in fear as any personal self-individual, and actually more so, truth be told. A fear I wouldn't have experienced if I'd just have observed the experience of the reptilians' situation from the real awareness, a real awareness that, yes, would have recognized and read the fear, but it would seem like, as all ideas do, to the real awareness, so very unreal, but a fear very tangible and all-consuming for the personal self, sat in the emotion of it. And it's one thing to speak of the fear that an individual appears to have, it's another to experience it, and the exact way it feels from the personal self perspective of the individual. And again, differing nuances of fear or any emotion are a greater palette then of variety, of created idea comparisons for ears recognitional purposes, and so from full personal self-immersion into the consciousness of another individual to a real awareness overview and indifference to the individual, a real awareness that could have been construed as also being his, but mine also, as it is the same overall real awareness, so no difference in reality. The individual was apprehended, and to the cops that captured him, he would explain the reasons for his identity thieving, and reveal then the nature of the consciousness I had been immersed in the first experience several months ago. For it would transpire that this individual was an alien, although his exact species was never determined, but he was of a species that were masterful shapeshifters, and as such he had assumed a human form. He was rather a bored alien, and for him, he delighted in alleviating his boredom by targeting a specific individual, a human, determining their function, their decided occupation, etc., then attempting to assume their identity and to see how long he could maintain the facade before being discovered. He could easily have shapeshifted into the exact form of those he targeted. He could have quite easily killed the genuine individual and simply replaced them, just like the character, the alien, in that series, Resident Alien. He could have studied the fine details of the individual he sought to assume. With his technological capability, he could have downloaded all memories of the target to himself to assist his deception. He could have altered files at the police station, erased memories, manipulated time. Nothing really prevented him from being able to execute a perfect and flawless assumption of the individual he was taking the identity of. But the alien found this very boring, so instead he took a far greater risk. He only stole the identity of the individual. He didn't even assume their form, just chose a random human form to shapeshift into, and in regards to any research into the individual's profession, the fine detail, and all the ways he could have ensured success, he never bothered with either. In this case, he stole the target's uniform, relocated to another city and police station, and jumped straight into the role. I'm uncertain how there wasn't communication between the two city police stations as to the curious presence of a sergeant in a city that wasn't his posting, but this alien seemed very convincing, as though he delighted in testing his silver-tongue acumen, that he could talk his way in or out of any situation, and as I said, he was a favourite cop of the people. Such was his engaging mannerism, and how easily relatable he was with people. But inevitably he would be found out. Such was the reckless way he went about his decided sensation of identity assuming and stealing. But then he delighted in that also, of being discovered, chased, all the drama that ensued. And he wasn't a violent or aggressively inclined alien. He would bestow no harm on another, and always eventually he would be backed into a corner, so to speak, confronted, or in this case arrested, and then the game was over. All this he explained quite openly to the cops, who now apprehended him, much to their bemusement, for in fact, despite being captured, he was never in any peril, as now, just as he always did when the game was up. He simply faded away teleporting his physical body from his predicament and back from whence he came. So my impression was indeed correct, and verified to be so, that I had been viewing initially from the perspective of the personal self of this alien as he went about his game. And then the scene switched, and I would find myself in the recreated house of my deceased grandparents, which, as I have explained before, is not the personal self-representation of the individuals who were my grandparents, but rather a recreation often utilized for when I have interactions and meetings with the guides on the real side. And generally, the guides also take the form of my deceased grandparents, always with a real awareness reading of the individuals to assure they are the guides and not the dark forces assuming their forms for the purposes of deception. Any intent other than what makes sense with life always easily detectable through a real awareness that is through and animates all consciousness, and therefore all ideas and intents of all the personal selves we might encounter, is available as impressions, beyond just the surface simulation, any outward form that the personal self alone would be resigned to. In the house, along with the guides, would be Jeremy also, another individual stepping up with Duane and the real guides, and I would find myself sharing the entire account of the experiences I have just shared here with them. Interestingly, I was reading it from a book that had this real side experience recounted as a short story among a number of others that the book contained. And the book, as it transpired, was not my own, but a book by Stephen King, a well-known and renowned author. But this was a book that he hadn't ever, in fact, written, at least not in this dimension or lifetime. This rather revealed, perhaps, the source of much of the material that such authors and indeed movie makers produce in their stories. For we are this one overall awareness, this awareness that is through all consciousness, that even absent of his recognition still allows access to all that is going on in creation now, irrespective of the position or so-called time that it took place. And despite individuals, overwhelmingly perhaps, being personal self-immersed, with no connection with their real awareness, the real awareness and life always is there, and always accessible, when and if we choose to do so. And very often we hear of how these established authors can find a place, a position with their awareness, where their books rather write themselves, and their personal selves almost as a vessel for the inspiration they are receiving. that the main authors and movie makers always reveal what's going on in creation is not necessarily due to that which they are intuitively or real awareness receiving, as they will very much be in the loop, as you generally can't be an established author or movie maker unless you're on the dark force payroll, as the controllers seek to manage the consciousness of humanity through their subliminal programming, and can't very well do that unless they manage those that are producing the books and movies. You can't really make it in the film, book, or music industry unless you agree with the controllers, and so what you produce must be in alignment with the way the controllers wish the consciousness to be moulded or programmed. But it's rather apparent that authors can find a place, aside from their consciousness of what they already know, where they can access that which they personally don't, but that which the real awareness can. This little adventure with the alien was an actual occurrence, as was my impression, a simulated experience that had taken place whenever it was decided, and that Stephen King, in whatever dimensional version it was, where he produced this book of short stories, had received this alien experience adventure just as anyone might a real side experience. He may even have had what he considered a dream, and had this experience view, and brought it back to the physical, or perhaps, having forgotten this real side experience, would write what came to him as an idea for a story that he assumed was from his imagination, but that filtered in from what he had experienced on the real side. Or maybe, indeed, he has a facility, as some authors do, to sit in this position of awareness while on the physical, where the stories just come from another place, beyond consciousness consideration. The real awareness providing experiences for established authors that, despite their controller bought off and controlling inclinations overall, something of a benefit, awareness speaking, can seep through, amidst all the stories that are for dark force consciousness controlling and subliminal embedding purposes. Or can it be also that this entire real side experience came from the imagination of Stephen King, that has as yet not made it to print? For whatever we think and imagine is instantly so on the real side, and no less a simulated reality than anything on the physical level. Everything on the physical began with the imagination, and so anything we do see from any life level, if it's a physical level actuality, or only a temporary thought form, there is little difference in its validity, as it is all simulation. None of it is real, and all can serve the same overall a purpose, irrespective of its source, as comparisons to recognize the is from.